Okay, afternoon everyone. As Kevin said, I'm Wesley from the WWF South Africa Land Program. I'm going to be presenting on biodiversity stewardship incentives, but more trying to stimulate discussion on incentives. I'm a bit of a newbie to this game, so I think it's an attempt to get you guys talking to move forward on incentives for biodiversity stewardship. So for a quick background as to why I'm here, there was a Protected Areas Stewardship Forum a Protected Areas Expansion Forum in February this year that was co-hosted by Department of Environmental Affairs and WWF. And some of the things that came out of that was the acknowledgement that biodiversity stewardship is a vital part of protected area expansion. It's cheaper to implement in the short and long term than land acquisition, and that incentives need to be supported. So an outcome from the forum was that there was a need for the development of a fact sheet on incentives in South Africa in order to allow for a national approach for stewardship officers. So as I said, I kind of want to structure this to ask more questions than give answers. So while I'm talking, I'd like obviously everyone to be thinking about kind of the questions that I'm going to be asking. The first is why develop the fact sheet, and I think this was covered a little bit at the forum. But members here, do you feel it would be helpful, necessary, helpful for landowners, helpful for conservation practitioners? And then what the fact sheet would entail. Is who's it going to target? Is it going to be, I think we've had discussion on, there's a difference between benefits and incentives. So what's going to go into that fact sheet? And if that also relates to how many fact sheets we would develop. So are you talking about one for private landowners and another for communal landowners? Maybe one for non-fiscal incentives and another for fiscal incentives? I think these kinds of things need to be discussed. How? So Dia from the forum with help from WWF, we're going to, I guess, lead with this process, but I think it's going to take everyone in the room and in stewardship in the country to really help develop a fact sheet that is relevant to the work that people are doing. And then where just relates to that. So will there be separate fact sheets for each province, or just one national or two national fact sheets? So this is just kind of the questions that I think should be considered before the development of the fact sheet. So then I found some categories that have been used to classify incentives around the world, and I thought I'd use these for us to look at what incentives are available in South Africa and where we can learn from different agencies and from different countries around the world. So the first category is regulatory and economic disincentives, which are laws, policies, and economic instruments that define required environmental performance standards and prescribe a penalty for non-compliance. So this includes government regulations, conservation compliance, where landowners must comply to some sort of environmental performance as a condition to be eligible to receive funding. And then simply financial charges and penalties, where payments that landowners make are made in compensation for land degradation or habitat degradation. The second suite of incentives are legal or statutory innovations. So these are new rules or regulations that in some way limit liability or issue some type of permit for habitat modification. So examples of these are safe harbor agreements, candidate agreements, and regulatory relief for landowners. Property rights tools refer to landowners being able to alter the rights of use or ownership on their land. Examples are conservation easements, which are used in South Africa, where a landowner can transfer some of their rights but still maintain management of their or ownership of their land. Covenants are another example, which are just agreements between landowners and a second party where there are certain land uses and practices that are stipulated. And stewardship exchange agreements where landowners implement conservation measures on their private land in exchange for use privileges on public lands. Market innovations are incentives that affect the value of a resource. So these include user fees, ecotourism, eco-labeling, things like mitigation banking and conservation banking, tradable development rights, I think are quite interesting places that we could look into. Financial incentives are quite variable, but basically are payments in exchange for some sort of habitat conservation practices or activities on land. Public tax incentives, I think, are available in the legislation in South Africa. It seems that implementation is another story, but this could be income, property, estate tax. And then facilitative incentives are measures that facilitate or assist landowners with participation or knowledge of what incentive programs and mechanisms are out there. So this could be education, training, technical assistance, establishment of administrative structures, landowner recognition programs, that kind of stuff. So I've kind of rushed through a lot of that, but it's just to get people thinking in maybe in those kinds of spaces. And then the next thing to think about, and it's a question I addressed to the working group, and I got some responses, was what the constraints are to implementing incentives and to offering incentives to landowners in the country. So some of the constraints that came up were a lack of trust between landowners and conservation practitioners or other authorities, a lack of skills within conservation practitioners. So this is more kind of relative to the communicative skills and social learning type skills. So I think a lot of us have a natural science kind of background and biology, ecological sciences backgrounds, where I think this relates to developing more skill within the communication and social side of stuff. A lack of capacity within organizations, obviously a lack of funding, a lack of resources more generally, a lack of alignment of priority areas of biodiversity stewardship people and on the one hand and funders on the other hand, and then limitations within rates legislation and policy. So these are some of the constraints that came up in, I guess, in my communication with people, and I think there are probably many more. The question, therefore, is what can be done to tackle some of these constraints. And again, these are responses from some of our colleagues. So one was the provision of support for covering costs of land management that the landowners incur, more flexibility from funders to better align those priority areas, efforts to decrease administrative burdens or to alleviate, I guess, the bureaucratic bottlenecks that exist, more feet on the ground, and then capacity to support collaboration and social learning type initiatives. So that talks not so much to top-down or bottom-up approaches, but to lateral learning initiatives between organizations, stakeholders, and communities. Another thing that I asked was a kind of wish list from people in their regions. What would they like to be able to offer landowners, and what maybe have landowners asked for or suggested as potential incentives that they would be interested in, that would get them interested to get into biodiversity stewardship. And I got a few responses. The first was for the provision of grazing and rehabilitation specialists, so that landowners can better manage not only their land but also the stewardship sites on their land. The development of a fencing fund to put up fences around stewardship sites or to improve fencing around those stewardship sites. And then more structured access to game donations, so to landowners who want to diversify to having game on their stewardship sites, or if they want to enter into kind of exchange agreements where they can set aside land for conservation in exchange for getting game. The last thing I wanted to look at was what can biodiversity stewardship people and conservationists take to the universities to say these are the questions that we want answered in our work that we do. So I've just got a couple of examples of those. So, and they're going to cover, the economic, natural sciences, ecological, ecosystem stuff, social stuff, psychology. I think it's a lot. I think it's happening now, but it's quite different to the more traditional conservation approach. So understanding what farmers see or value as incentives. This is being done, I think, in the Western Cape and elsewhere. But I think a lot more work probably needs to get done in that arena. Research to better understand the true cost of land management to the landowners. Research into the efficacy of DEA and NRM programs. I think that's also just geared towards having to continually monitor and determine if programs that have been in place are still working. So research to better understand the potential of payment for ecosystem services. I think there's been a lot of literature internationally. Maybe some more research can be done in the South African context. And then potential for alternate incentives programs. So if there are incentives that we would want to implement from that are being used internationally, would there be opportunities to maybe pilot those in certain areas and have little research questions around those? I think I rushed through that a bit, but hopefully it's kind of stimulated a bit of discussion, or will stimulate a bit of discussion. I'd like to thank everyone who did respond to my emails that I sent out frantically a couple of weeks ago, and to Greg for having a chat. Thanks very much.